DNA results from Peru's 3,000-year-old elongated skulls just came back. Here's what they found. In a locked storage room in southern Peru sit hundreds of human skulls that look like nothing you have ever seen on a living person. The back of the head stretches upward and backward, sometimes doubling the length of a normal skull, until the shape looks almost like something out of science fiction. For more than a decade, a claim has circulated online that DNA testing on these skulls came back with results so strange that scientists refused to publish them. Mutations found in no known human population, a story of hidden history, foreign bloodlines, and a cover-up reaching into the halls of mainstream archaeology. It is one of the most viral archaeological mysteries of the internet age. It is also, when you follow the actual evidence, a story about how a real and fascinating culture got buried under a myth. Today we are going to look at what the Paracas skulls actually are, what real scientists have actually found when they study them, and why the terrifying DNA result story falls apart the moment you ask a very simple question. Where is the study? The Paracas Peninsula sits on the southern coast of Peru, a strip of desert so dry that some parts of it have not seen meaningful rainfall in recorded history. In 1927, a Peruvian archaeologist named Julio Tello began excavating there and uncovered something extraordinary. Beneath the sand were dozens, and eventually hundreds, of burial sites, bodies wrapped in layers of intricately woven textile, some bundles containing dozens of separate garments, buried with gold ornaments, ceramics, and feathered headdresses. Tello had found the necropolis of a civilization that predated the Inca by well over 1,000 years, a culture archaeologists now call the Paracas, who lived along that coastline roughly between 800 BCE and 100 BCE. It remains one of the most important archaeological discoveries in South American history, not because of anything mysterious, but because of what it plainly and verifiably contains. Some of the finest textile work produced anywhere in the ancient world, a complex mortuary tradition, and clear evidence of a stratified society with a wealthy elite class. And yes, a striking number of the skulls found at Paracas are elongated. This part is completely real. It is not a hoax, not a trick of photography, not a fringe claim. If you look at the skulls preserved in the Paracas History Museum in Peru, or in the private Paracas Museum run by researcher and collector groups in Ica, the elongation is dramatic and undeniable. Some skulls have a cranial vault that slopes backward at a steep angle, giving the head a length far beyond the normal human range. This is the one piece of the story that every serious researcher, skeptic, and believer alike agrees on completely. Where the story splits is in what caused that shape, and this is where you need to understand a practice that shows up again and again across human history: intentional cranial deformation. Humans are born with skulls made of separate bone plates that have not yet fused. For the first year or two of life, an infant's skull is soft and pliable, which is exactly why newborns can pass safely through the birth canal, and exactly why gentle, sustained pressure applied during that window can permanently reshape how the skull grows. Cultures on nearly every inhabited continent have practiced this deliberately. The Maya bound infant heads between two boards to create a flattened, sloped profile. Groups in the Caucasus and Central Asia, including populations linked to the Huns, produce tall, conical skulls using tight wrapping. Communities in North America's Pacific Northwest flatten the foreheads of infants in cradle boards. In parts of Africa and Melanesia, the same basic technique using cloth, cord, or wooden frames produced a wide range of head shapes considered marks of beauty, status, or clan identity. Cranial binding does not require exotic tools or hidden knowledge. It requires cloth, boards, and time, applied to a skull that is still growing. The Paracas elite appear to have practiced an unusually intense version of this. Archaeologists studying the burials have found the actual binding materials in some graves: strips of cloth and small wooden boards positioned exactly where you would expect if they had been used to compress and redirect the growth of an infant skull over months or years. The extreme elongation seen in some Paracas skulls is on the far end of what's been documented worldwide, but it sits on the same spectrum, produced by the same basic mechanism as head-shaping traditions found from Peru to France to the Philippines. Because the pressure is applied to bone that is still soft and still growing, the final shape can be dramatic without requiring any change to the underlying biology of the person being shaped. So where did the idea come from that this was something else entirely? That the Paracas skulls carried DNA that terrified scientists and pointed toward an origin outside the normal human family tree? The claim traces back almost entirely to one source, a Canadian-based writer and self-described researcher named Brian Forster, who has spent years promoting the Paracas skulls through books, YouTube videos, and paid tours, often in partnership with alternative history media. In 2014, Forster announced that he had sent skull samples for genetic testing and that an unnamed geneticist had found mitochondrial DNA markers unlike anything seen in Native American, European, or any other known population mutations, he claimed, that didn't match any species currently in the database used by the lab. Here is the problem, and it is not a small one. No peer-reviewed paper describing these results has ever been published. No named laboratory has put its reputation behind the claim. No independent scientist has been able to examine the raw sequencing data. The geneticist behind the original announcement was not named at the time, which immediately should raise a flag for anyone evaluating a scientific claim, because in real genetics, credibility rests entirely on being able to check the data, the methodology, and the chain of custody of the sample. A result that cannot be reviewed is not a result. It's an announcement. When actual geneticists and physical anthropologists were asked to weigh in on the claim, the response was consistent and unremarkable in the best sense of that word. Nothing about it required abandoning what we already understand about human genetics or human migration into the Americas. Ancient DNA researchers pointed out something crucial about how these claims were framed. Mitochondrial DNA testing sorts people into broad lineage groups called haplogroups, and interpreting those results requires comparing them against enormous, carefully curated reference databases. If a sample is degraded, contaminated with modern DNA from handling, or run through incomplete comparison databases, it is entirely possible to get a readout that looks unfamiliar. Not because the person belonged to some undocumented lineage from the Caucasus or Mesopotamia, but because the sample or the analysis was flawed. Ancient DNA from a 3,000-year-old skull that has been handled by generations of archaeologists, museum staff, and now paying tourists is exceptionally vulnerable to exactly this kind of contamination. Sterile ancient DNA protocols exist for a reason, and claims that skip past those protocols without naming a lab, a methodology, or a publication venue don't meet the basic bar required to overturn an established scientific picture. And that established picture, built from an enormous and genuinely peer-reviewed body of genetic research spanning thousands of samples across North and South America, is not fragile. Indigenous populations of the Americas descend overwhelmingly from populations that migrated from Northeast Asia, beginning more than 15,000 years ago. This isn't a single old study. It has been confirmed repeatedly through decades of published, cross-checked ancient DNA work on skeletal remains from Alaska to Patagonia, including sites in Peru itself. A finding that truly overturned that picture would be one of the biggest stories in the history of genetics, and it would not need a Peruvian tour guide's blog post to get attention. It would be published in a journal like Nature or Science within a news cycle, because it's exactly the kind of result that makes a scientist's career. The absence of that publication, over more than a decade now, is itself strong evidence about how seriously the underlying data holds up. It's also worth being honest about something else that gets left out of the viral version of this story. The claims about the skull's physical anomalies don't hold up as well as they're presented either. The idea that some Paracas skulls have 25% greater cranial volume than a normal human, or bones structurally unlike a normal human skull, traces back to informal measurements and photographs circulated by the same handful of promoters, not to published osteological studies using standard forensic methodology. Trained physical anthropologists who have examined elongated skulls from Paracas and similar sites elsewhere in the world have found exactly what the cranial deformation model predicts. The skull is reshaped, but the sutures, the growth lines where the skull's bone plates meet, are still present and functioning the way they always do in a normal developing human head, just pushed into an unusual geometry by the applied pressure. Elongation changes shape. It does not, on its own, create a fundamentally different skeleton. None of this means the Paracas people are boring, or that there's nothing worth wondering about. Quite the opposite. The real story here is genuinely remarkable, and in some ways more interesting than the myth. Why would a Peruvian coastal elite, 3,000 years ago, choose to permanently reshape the heads of their children into such an extreme form? The most likely answer, supported by comparative anthropology from cultures around the world that did the same thing, is status and identity. An elongated skull was probably a visible, unmistakable marker of belonging to the ruling class, something you could see from across a room, a mark that couldn't be faked or removed later in life the way jewelry or clothing could be. It tied a person's very body to their position in society, from infancy onward. That is a genuinely striking thing for a culture to have believed strongly enough to practice on their own newborns for generation after generation, and it says something real about how deeply status was woven into Paracas' identity. The textiles tell a similarly rich story without needing any embellishment. Paracas weavers produced cloth using cotton and alpaca or vicuña fiber, dyed in dozens of distinct colors using natural pigments, in techniques so fine that some textile historians consider them among the best ever produced by any pre-industrial civilization anywhere on Earth. The imagery woven into these textiles, feline figures, birds, mythological beings with multiple limbs and elaborate headdresses, gives us a genuine window into how the Paracas understood their world, their gods, and their dead. This is a civilization that deserves to be known for the extraordinary things it actually did, not reduced to a prop in a story about aliens or lost continents. So, why did the terrifying DNA version of this story spread so much further than the real archaeology ever did? Partly, it's simple. A claim about impossible ancient DNA and a cover-up is more shareable than a claim about infant cranial binding techniques, even though the second one is the one that's actually true and actually interesting once you dig into it. Partly, it's because real science is genuinely slow and cautious in exactly the way that frustrates people looking for a quick answer. Legitimate ancient DNA research requires expensive sequencing, strict contamination controls, peer review, and years between sample collection and publication, while a video announcing a shocking discovery can go online the same day it's recorded. And partly, it's because framing mainstream archaeology as something actively hiding the truth is a much better story than the more mundane reality, which is that most professional archaeologists and geneticists simply never encountered a testable, citable claim in the first place, because one was never actually put in front of them in a form that could be checked. It's also worth naming clearly what didn't happen here, because it matters. No credible, named laboratory has published peer-reviewed findings describing non-human or exotic DNA from the Paracas skulls. No geneticist with a verifiable institutional affiliation has put their name behind the mutation claims in a way that other scientists can independently test. What has happened is that a promotional claim, made without the standard tools of scientific verification, was repeated across videos, articles, and social posts until repetition made it feel like established fact. That is worth being skeptical of, not because mystery isn't fun, and not because we should assume every unconventional claim in archaeology is automatically wrong, but because the actual standard for a claim this extraordinary is publication, replication, and independent verification, and none of those things have happened here in over a decade. If you want to actually chase the real mystery of the Paracas, the mystery is sitting right there in plain sight and doesn't need any embellishment. How did a coastal desert society with no direct contact, as far as we can currently verify, with the great civilizations of Mesopotamia or the Andean highlands, develop textile technology this advanced, iconography this complex, and a social hierarchy rigid enough that people were willing to permanently alter their children's skulls to display it? Those are real, open, fascinating questions that actual Peruvian and international archaeologists are still working on, using excavation, textile analysis, isotope studies that trace where individuals grew up and what they ate, and yes, legitimate ancient DNA research using properly published, peer-reviewed methods. That research has told us real things about the population history of the Andes, patterns of migration within South America, genetic continuity and change across different Andean cultures over thousands of years, and the relationships between coastal and highland populations. It just hasn't told us that the Paracas elite descended from the Caucasus Mountains, because nobody has actually run and published that study. What we're left with, once you strip away the parts of the story that were never verified, is something that doesn't need to be exaggerated to be worth your attention. a desert peninsula in Peru that preserved, almost perfectly, the remains and possessions of a civilization that flourished 1,000 years before the Inca ever existed. A textile tradition so advanced that pieces pulled from those tombs are still studied by museums and universities as some of the finest ever produced by human hands. A cultural practice of head shaping that connects the Paracas to a genuinely global human tradition stretching from ancient France to the American Southwest to the Pacific Islands. All of it done for reasons of identity, status, and belief that are deeply, recognizably human, not alien. And a cautionary story, still unfolding, about how a single unverified announcement, repeated enough times without ever being checked, can travel further and faster than the actual archaeology it claims to be about. The skulls themselves are not going anywhere. They remain in museum collections in Peru, available, in principle, for exactly the kind of rigorous, published, peer-reviewed genetic study that would finally settle these questions with real evidence instead of viral claims. If that study is ever done properly with a named laboratory, a transparent methodology, and results submitted for independent review, it will be genuinely exciting news, whatever it finds, because it will be real. Until then, the honest answer to what the DNA results actually showed is this: no credible, checkable results showing anything outside known human genetics have ever been published, and the elongated shape of these remarkable skulls is best explained by the same deliberate, well-documented cranial binding practiced by cultures across the ancient world. That's not a disappointing answer. It's a real one, about a real and extraordinary civilization that doesn't need a myth to be worth remembering.